Ribald, a cozy mystery adventure. The Gumbo Files. Written by Curtis Long. Narrated by Scott Kerr. Chapter 1. Danny Gumbo's big hands began to tremble with excitement, so he knew he'd better rest a moment. He sat back on the edge of the lower bunk and dribbled a little Duke's mixture onto a brown paper and twisted the ends. In the adjacent cell, a phonograph wailed something about a Japanese Sandman. Gumbo grinned crookedly. A swell piece to be playing these days. But the poor old prisoner didn't know any better. He'd been locked up so long he was stir-simple. Anyway, you don't worry about such trivia as war in San Jacinto Penitentiary. You thought only of escape, if you could still think at all. Gumbo laid his cigarette on the rim of the wash basin and went back to his task. He had made an ingenious cutting tool of a diamond day from a coffin, claimed by a two-tipped phonograph needle, a nail, and a piece of string. One end of the string was attached to the nail, which Gumbo held steadily in a tiny pit in the iron door of his cell. The hard-tipped needle was tied to the other end of the string, about 3 inches from the nail. By revolving the needle against the door, Gumbo had tediously cut a 6-inch circle in the metal near the lock. It was hard work, and it took time, but in the past 7 weeks he had almost penetrated the door. When the prisoner's phonograph stopped, Gumbo stopped. He made a dun-colored paste of water and floor dust and plugged the cut. His hands started to shake again. Bo Jenkins, his cellmate, lowered the confession magazine he was reading and leaned out of the upper bunk. "Don't you get enough, Gumbo?" Gumbo secreted his implement behind a pipe. "I'm through, Bo," he said softly. "Through? I can punch it out with my fist." He took a restless turn around the cell and picked up his half-smoked butt. Bo made a sighing noise through his false teeth. He was a thin, dried-out little man in his 60s, with sunken cheeks from going without a plate for too long, and wiry snow-white brows. His eyes were bad, and constant squinting had puckered the skin around them. At one time he had been tops in the engraving racket. But when the federal men began to recognize his handiwork and salted him away on a counterfeiting rap, he turned to forgery on his release. After a few lush seasons, however, his eyes began to trouble him. He muffed a few good takes and did another jolt. He dropped down the scale to writing checks. He made a killing in that too, and kited enough wallpaper from Seattle to Miami to retire. But somehow it had slipped through his fingers, and when he was nailed in California, his prior convictions finished him. A tough DA set him up for life under the habitual criminal law. Now, resigned to the inevitable, he spent his time studying the fate of girls gone wrong. He avoided Gumbo's eyes and rustled the magazine in his hand. "This woman now, she fell for a married man, and he was the wrong one." Gumbo jerked the tattered magazine from the old man's hand and tossed it on the table. "Forget women. Talk to me. Didn't you hear me say I was through?" Bo sidled out of his bunk like a tired spider and sat with Gumbo on the lower one. Gumbo built him a smoke. "I don't want to talk about it," whined the old convict. "You're crazy, Gumbo. The guards will blow you in half before you get out of this block. If you do make it out to the yard, the gun bulls in the tower will get you. Listen, boy, you ain't got a chance in a million. God Almighty, I've seen more than a dozen kids chopped down in my time." Gumbo laughed and clapped the old man on the leg. "We've been all over that, Bo. 4 years has been too long. 4 more, and I'll be as stir-simple as the rest of these in here." He cocked his head, listening for the cat-footed tread of the guard, and then went on. "I'll make it tonight when they change shifts at midnight. The fresh bulls won't have time to get their eyes used to the darkness. I'll make it. It's you I'm worried about, Bo. Come with me." Bo wagged his head. "Ha! Not me, kid. Not a chance. I wouldn't go if I was sure we could cut it." "Why?" "Well, lots of reasons. In the first place, I can't swim enough to buck them currents to the mainland. But that ain't it. Look, I know what it's like to be hunted. You don't. You lie out in the rain, hungry, cold, scared of the sound of your own heart pounding. You can't trust nobody. Then there's always a woman. Why, I was just reading about a woman who—" "Never mind that," Bo interrupted. "Remember this. Whether I make it out or not, they'll take it out on you." "So what?" "I don't want it that way," Bo shrugged. "There ain't no choice. I'm not rat enough to squeal, and I can't talk you out of it." "No, You can't talk me out of it. Okay, so I get 30 days in the hole. On bread and water. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. That don't worry me. Well, it worries me, Gumbo grumbled. I don't like it. I've got a swell angle when we get out of here. There's a certain guy, a big shot, who'll be tickled. Bo stopped him. Nix! I don't want to know nothing about it, boy. What I don't hear, I can't repeat. Gumbo knew the futility of the argument with the old man, so he gave up. He rose and studied his own reflection in the wavy mirror above the washstand. Tell me, on the level, Bo, have I changed much since I was thrown into this hell 4 years ago? Bo wiped his watery eyes and angled for a better look. Yep, you're different, Gumbo, he temporized. Maybe for the better, I don't know. You was a nice, scrawny, wide-eyed kid who talked too much. How old are you, son? 23. No kiddin'. Geez, you look 10 years older than that now. You hardened, kid, inside and out. I hates to see a lad get hard. It shows in his eyes most. It's a look the bulls and coppers spot first. You're marked, Gumbo. Gumbo stared at his image. It'll wear off, he reasoned. But he wondered if it would. He stopped smiling. In the glass, he saw a gray man, gray clothes, gray skin. There was no surplus of fat on the hard, bitter face. The eyes were pointed and bright as the chipped diamond of his needle. The nose and chin were almost excessively firm. The high forehead leading up to the tawny, close-cropped curls redeemed the face somewhat. He tried to smile, and the bitterness vanished. He made a mental note of that phenomenon. Maybe I've just grown up, he offered. Maybe, grunted Bo, and climbed back up into his berth. Gumbo reached under his mattress and pulled out an old magazine. It fell open naturally to a full-page portrait of a man. Gumbo took it over to the mirror and compared the portrait with his own image, as he had 100 times in the past. Except for a certain dissolute quality and a difference in ages, the picture might have been of his own face. It was not. He tore out the page, shredded it methodically, and flushed it down the toilet. After that, he stretched out in his bunk. Call me up at 11:30, he called up to Bo, so I'll have time to say goodbye. In the new cell blocks, the doors were made of steel bars, opened by a central control. But here in the old block, the panels were solid iron, each with its own old-fashioned lock. When Gumbo had first cooked up his scheme for escape nearly 8 months ago, he had wrangled a transfer to this old block. Now his plans had matured, and he was set for the crush-out. It was no trouble to pry away the disc he had cut into the floor, and picking the lock was a cinch. The wrench came when he had to say goodbye to Bo. Gumbo was surprised how deep was his affection for the old forger. Damned if his eyes didn't smart when they shook hands. Both knew it was for the last time. Gumbo was on a one-way junket. Either he'd cut it, or he'd wind up in the morgue. Gumbo waited until the new guard passed along the catwalk on his first round, then eased himself into the corridor. 100 convicts could see him, yet that gave him no worry. None of them would dare raise an alarm. A rat wouldn't last 48 hours in San Jacinto. He paused a moment, and the corridor was so quiet it startled him. He saw Bo's pallid face watching him from the small circular opening in the cell door. He smiled and paddled on his way. He scrambled to the roof of the old block and, as expected, found a skylight ajar. That deal had cost Gumbo a 6-month supply of tobacco. Cheap enough. There was a fog outside, but not as much as he had prayed for. Well, he couldn't turn back now, even if he wanted to. He edged along the roof and lay belly flat until a car drove up outside the main gate and honked to attract the tower bull. Some guard coming home from a double-billed show in the city. Gumbo set his jaw. Someday soon, he'd be going to city shows, if luck held. He chose the moment to drop off the roof and dart across the open space to the shadows of the high stone wall. He crouched there, staring up. The top of the wall was brightly illuminated by floodlights, broken by darkened towers where the gun guard sat with 30-30s cocked. Gumbo hated them, hated more the thing they stood for. 8 hours daily, year in and year out, they waited like tireless cats, tensed for the moment when some foolhardy con would try for the wall. Gumbo had his own grudges, but he couldn't imagine sitting for years waiting to kill a man he didn't even know. But that wall had to be scaled. There was no other out. Gumbo cursed the gun bulls thoroughly, and the outburst relieved his tension. For 4 years he had been studying this wall, and he knew his spot. He removed his shoes, and with a broken file chiseled out enough mortar for a toehold. That took him the better part of an hour before he worked up to where he could reach the rim with his hands. He clung there a moment, dreading to run the gauntlet. The old Gumbo had come back to haunt him, the wide-eyed kid that Bo had spoken about. He was scared. Then the new Gumbo, recreated by 4 years of hell, took over. He gave a growl that was a half prayer, half oath, and heaved himself into the light. In the silence, the crash of the rifle was stunning. An unseen hand seemed to pluck at Gumbo's shirt and nearly jerked him back into the prison yard. The light blinded him so that he couldn't see the swirling black waters below. Momentarily, he lost his sense of direction. Then he bent his knees and precipitated his body into space. The rifles barked twice more before the water took him in. The cold of it knocked the breath out of him, but he stayed under until his lungs could stand no more. When he surfaced, the sirens were screaming. Inquisitive fingers of lights laid a pattern on the water, searching for him. He submerged hastily, swimming with long, cautious strokes so as not to mar the black surface. Somehow he started to think of Bo Jenkins, sitting back there in his cell, haunted by the sounds of siren and barking guns. Bo would be taking it worse than Gumbo. Much worse. A good guy, Bo. Gumbo would never forget him, if he lived to remember anything. Bo had taught him 1,000 tricks of forgery in the endless hours of their confinement, because it was a necessary facet in the bright diamond of Gumbo's plan. But it was well that Bo had stayed. He couldn't have made that wall. Bo had been locked up too long, and now his only interest lay in the stories of girls gone wrong. The powerful currents were sweeping Gumbo towards the point. The tower guards knew that. Their spotlight set the water on fire, and a machine gun beat a tireless tattoo. But Danny Gumbo knew about that current too, and instead of fighting it as the others had before him, he swam with it, working in close to the wall. Neither the spotlights nor the machine guns could be depressed enough to reach him there. He smiled bitterly. That's what planning could do for a man. The siren died away, as if tired, then began to shriek again in a rising crescendo. Gumbo spent the balance of the night and the following day in the hold of an ancient schooner, long abandoned on the mudflats. Twice a police launch came by, but did not stop. In the late afternoon, the sun edged through the fog, making it warm without too much visibility. Gumbo stripped, and while his clothes were drying on the rotting deck, he ate a few of the shellfish he found clinging to the hulk. The fresh water contained in them revived him. When the sun disappeared beyond the gate, he slid into the water and struck out on the long haul to the mainland. When he finally reached Valencia, he crawled under a fishing pier. Resting there, he heard the steam whistle of a factory plant mark the end of the swing shift. Midnight. Gumbo grinned. He'd been free just 24 hours, and the first hurdle was over. He stayed hidden until the workers cleared off the streets, and when at last the old town settled down, he made his way up the main drag. The sight of so many young men in uniform surprised him, and twice he passed little groups on shore patrols. He had a sudden desire to get into the army, to bury himself among the millions in the comforting nonentity of a uniform, but a moment's reflection told him that was not for him. His fingerprints would land him back in prison. In the Swiss-Italian section of town, he found an old second-hand store. The rear door gave him no trouble, and he traded his sodden prison garb for a nondescript brown suit and a pair of worn tennis shoes. He stumbled over an old crutch, which gave him an idea, and when he made the highway, it won him a ride on a fruit truck bound for Los Lobos. The driver was a good little guy who had recently come out of Arkansas. He was talkative, so Gumbo let him ramble without paying too much attention. "We come out here to California to help win this war," the driver explained. "My wife's a riveter, my daughter's a guard, and my boy's in the Coast Guard. But me, they wouldn't give me no defense job." "Tough," muttered Gumbo. He wished he'd remember to steal a pack of smoke somewhere. He could have used a few drags. "Why?" babbled the driver, as if Gumbo had asked. "I don't mind telling you. I ain't ashamed. I done time, see? It's all over and done for, but still, they won't give me a job." Gumbo gave him a suspicious glance, but the poor boob was leveling. "Yes, sir, I done time. For peddling hooch. And, mister, it was good stuff, even if I do say it." He detailed his formula. "The best people was me customers, even the DA himself. The very guy what sent me up. I can't figure why they won't let me work in no defense plant." "Tough," Gumbo repeated. The man's whine was grating on his nerves. "Oh, hell, I don't care. This is a job anyhow. Say, bub, how far are you a-going?" Well, you said you were going to Los Lobos. Sure, but, well, that's where I'm going. Well, yeah, but that's all of it, Gumbo cut him short. Well, hell, I was just trying to be neighborly, grumbled the driver, aggrieved. It was a 13-mile walk to San Carlos, and Gumbo reached the outskirts by dawn. It was too late to do anything, so he spent the day in a culvert, alternately dozing and rehearsing his act. For the past year, he had mentally written and revised the script until it had seemed perfection itself. But now that the time had come for the first and only performance, he felt restless and uneasy. There would be no repeat. If he muffed his first chance, he was through. As it started to rain, Bo's warning came back to him. I know what it's like to be hunted. You lay in the rain, hungry and cold, scared of the sound of your own heart pounding. By dusk, the culvert began to flow, so Gumbo crawled into an orchard where he sat hunched and miserable until sometime after midnight. A small inner voice kept urging him to scram and hop a freight train east, any place away from San Carlos, but Gumbo stubbornly closed his mind against it. Gambling had got him into trouble in the first place, and he was determined to gamble on this one chance, a chance in a million, to come out on top. If the wheel of fate dealt him a double zero, he was set for life. If not, he'd take it without a squawk. So far, he had 2 full days of freedom. He shivered. Bo called the shots up till now. He half yearned for the comparative warmth of his old cell. Walking again, he felt better. The crutch was a damn nuisance, but a good blind. So accurate to say that there were 2 Gumbo he clung to it. Passing an alley, the smell of fresh coffee tantalized him to the point where he almost tried to panhandle a cup, but he resisted the impulse and continued across town. He came to the big house at last. His knees began to shake so hard he really found use for the crutch. The house was dark, but Gumbo had expected that. He scrunched down behind the hedge to wait. He could afford to wait, now that he had reached his objective. His performance could not start until his audience had arrived. A little later, he heard a siren wail somewhere uptown. It gave him an unpleasant constriction in his diaphragm, even though he assured himself it couldn't be for him. San Carlos was the last place on earth the law would expect to find Gumbo Wire. Chapter 2. It was a perfect California night. The sky was clear and mottled with stars, and the rain had brought out the perfume of flowers and the rich scent of the earth. It was cold, clean. Gumbo, crouched behind the hedge, was torn by conflicting emotions. Perhaps it would be Wires. One, the boy who desired to escape from all the evil and misery that had come to him, and sought only peace and happiness. And the other Gumbo, older, harder, who was guided by 4 years of pent-up hate and wanted revenge against what he considered an injustice. Sure, he'd been guilty, to a degree, but not for what they'd hung on him. He jerked back into the shadows as a car turned the corner. Light swept across the carefully manicured lawn as the machine swerved towards the curb and stopped. A car door slammed, then 2 men walked up the flagstones to the house. Even in semi-darkness, Gumbo could mark the difference in the pair. One was tall, smooth-limbed, Dean-appearing. The other, squat, shambling, monkey-armed. The tall man keyed his way into the mansion, and the shaggy gorilla shuffled back to the car. When the machine had gone, Gumbo crawled out of hiding and sat watching the house. A light appeared in a second-floor room. Gumbo carefully counted off the windows from the rear, orienting the room in his mind. There must be no mistakes. Satisfied, he settled back. He looked at his hands, flexed them, and grinned. They were strong hands. They could be lethal. After the lights went out, Gumbo waited another half hour for the house to settle down. It was not difficult to wait. He had learned patience in San Jacinto, so he spent his time conning the place. There was a trumpet vine reaching close to the window he sought, and he was tempted to use it. But eventually he decided on his original plan to use the back door. He had never been in this house, but he had dreamed of entering it for so long that it seemed almost familiar ground. A thin flat of steel, inserted back of the molding opposite the lock, opened the door. Standing inside the utter darkness, Gumbo had his first twinge of fear. He hadn't been in any kind of house in over 4 years. and there were strange odors that disturbed him. He skirted the kitchen, recognized it by the smell, and eased his way along a hall. Funny, Gumbo thought, how a guy's palms will sweat. He went on up, and when he stepped onto the landing, he knew he was lost. In desperation, he eased open a door and sidled into a room. He stood absolutely motionless, trying to sense if this was the right spot. Scared of the sound of your own heart pounding. The scent of perfume came to him, opening old wounds. He heard gentle breathing off to his left. Panic nearly betrayed him. He waited, wondering what he should do. Then rage welled up, and he knew he'd never quit his search until this thing was done. This was the wrong room. He backed into the corridor. He leaned against the wall and exhaled heavily, trying to stop the crazy thudding of his own heart. Somehow, in all his methodical scheming, he had not reckoned on East Chastain having a wife. I ought to scram, the gentler Gumbo argued. I ought to get the hell out of San Carlos and stay out. But the old hates were stronger. So he tiptoed down the hall and tried another door. This time he knew he had reached the trail's end. The aroma of scotch and good Havana smoke told him that. He turned slowly as his ears located the irregular breathing of the man in the bed. The hard Gumbo took over. His heart steadied. He actually smiled as he groped along the wall for the light switch. He flipped the switch, calling softly. East. The man's head reared off the pillow and blinked unbelievingly at Gumbo wire over the edge of the sheet. His features were a blueprint of fear. Then, with incredible swiftness, he whipped a snub-nosed revolver from under his pillow. Gumbo said, "Take it easy, Chastain. I'm not armed." The face, framed against the snowy linen like a disemboweled entity, fascinated Gumbo. It looked older than the picture in the magazine had led him to believe. There were salt and pepper patches on the temples and little purple-rimmed pouches under the eyes. Yet, essentially, it was Gumbo's own face staring back at him from a different world. Chastain found his voice. "What in the hell are you doing here? Who are you?" With his empty hand, he felt for the telephone on the bedstand. "Hold it," Gumbo cautioned. "You've nothing to be afraid of. Hear what I've got to say. After that, you can call the cops if you still want to." "What's to stop me from calling them now?" "Nothing." Chastain kept his hand on the instrument. "Talk fast," he warned. Gumbo turned his back and crossed to the dresser. He picked up a small hand mirror and tossed it onto the bed. "Take a gander in that," he suggested. "Then look at me. So what? I've never seen you before. You've seen me every day of your life, East. I'm you." "Crazy as a loon," growled Chastain, and picked up the receiver. Gumbo felt the sweat ooze onto his forehead and dampen his palms. This was the moment on which he had built all his hopes on, a play that had to be completed to perfection, and he was bungling it. "What I'm trying to tell you," he said hoarsely, "is that we're dead ringers for each other. Can't you grasp the possibilities of that?" Chastain hesitated, then lowered the receiver back onto its prong. He picked up the mirror, stole a quick glance at his reflection, then scowled at Gumbo. "It's registering," thought Gumbo prayerfully. "No, I don't get it. Why'd you come sneaking into my house like a thief?" "I am a thief," Gumbo admitted dryly. "A thief and a gambler. But so are you. Look, I just crushed out of San Jacinto 2 days ago. I came directly here to offer you a good deal." He paused to let the impact of that soak in. "East, I know a lot about you. I've studied your setup for years. You operate the gambling concession here in San Carlos. You're tied into the political machine here. You're a big shot, but you're also poison to some people. There's at least a dozen guys in San Jacinto right now who just live for the day when they can get out to stick a slug in you. You're hot, man. Hot." "Go on," Chastain urged softly. He had a grip on himself now. "Okay. I'm hot, too, in a different way. We got several things in common. We look alike, we're hot, and we want to live off the fat of the land. You're my one chance. Maybe I'm 17 yours. I'll do anything, and no holds barred. You're a rat and a coward, East. You're plain yellow, and you know it, but you're smart and cunning. You're beginning right now to see plenty of ways I could take the heat off you." "But who the hell are you?" Gumbo smiled bitterly. "I'm you, East. I got no other identity. When you want a dirty job done that you haven't got the guts to do yourself, I'm you. And the rest of the time, I'll keep out of sight." What I do then is my own business. Ah, you've got some angles of your own, eh? Gumbo shrugged. Haven't we all? East Chastain digested that. Then, keeping Gumbo covered with the gun, he lifted the receiver. Police headquarters, he called softly. Gumbo went stiff. He thought of running, but he couldn't make the door. So he stood there while Chastain got his number. Captain Howard, please, the gambler requested, and shifted his gun to a more comfortable position. As Gumbo waited, he studied the other man. The picture had fooled him. Outwardly, they looked alike, but there the resemblance ceased. Chastain might be a coward inside, but he had a gambler's trick of stifling his features, like a drawn shade. His eyes stayed bright, yet reflected nothing. His lips grew thin and flat and remained that way. It ceased to be a face and became a mask instead. The phone clicked. The gambler said, "Howard? East. Easton Chastain." "Sure, fine. Say, who was the mug who broke out of the state prison a couple days ago? Gumbo? Never heard of him." "Oh, a local boy. Yeah, I remember the case. Vaguely. Murder?" As he listened, his eyes half closed, and he watched Gumbo sleepily. "How do you know he's dead if you didn't find the body?" "Oh, I see. Swept out to sea?" No particular reason. Some guy mentioned it during the game tonight. I was just curious. I'll be in to see you one of these days." "Sure. Thanks, Howard." Chastain pronged the receiver. Gumbo exhaled, relieved, and managed a grin. "You're smart, East." There was a long pause. East still had his hand on the telephone. His face seemed pale, and his lips were tightly compressed. Gumbo held his breath again. Suddenly, East said, "Help yourself to a drink on the stand behind you." "I can sure use one," Gumbo laughed, turning to the bottle. "Although I'd rather have a sandwich. Haven't eaten for 3 days. He was lifting the glass when he heard a door open down the hall. East had thrown back the covers and was sitting on the edge of the bed. He frowned and gestured Gumbo into a clothes closet. As Gumbo ducked out of sight, a woman entered the room. "Well, hello, Rachel," East greeted her. "This is a surprise." The closet door stood slightly ajar, and when she moved within his sector, Gumbo saw a small, proud figure in a white Chanel robe. "I thought I heard voices," she said a little stiffly. "Oh, that! I was on the telephone," East told her. Gumbo saw she didn't believe him. She glanced around the room and for an instant stared directly into the closet. Although Gumbo was standing in total darkness, he couldn't believe she didn't see him. But he had a good look at her, and he was surprised. She wasn't at all the sort of woman he would have expected to find around East Chastain. She was quality. Her oval face was finely chiseled and sensitive. She had soft brown hair hung loosely over her shoulders, and her eyes were clear and a little cold. Gumbo tried to read her expression and failed. The way she looked at her husband puzzled Gumbo. He couldn't tell whether it was contempt or just plain hopelessness. He knew only that hers was a good face, and that it contrasted with Chastain's. "East," she said exasperatedly, "you're not bringing your filthy business here into this house, are you? I won't have it." "Whew," breathed Gumbo to himself. "She doesn't know I'm here." Chastain grunted and stood up. He was a big man, as big as Gumbo, but not as straight. He had a noticeable paunch. "You're dreaming," he grumbled. "We've been all over that stuff, Rachel. Now go back to bed." She ignored the command. "Where are you going?" "Out." "Out where?" "Out," East repeated harshly. The woman hesitated, and her firm little chin rose to an aggressive angle. She seemed about to flare up, then changed her mind. Her shoulders sagged perceptibly. Gumbo felt suddenly very sorry for her. Despite her Paddington poise, she was only a kid, maybe 22. "East," she said tiredly, "I've about reached the end of my rope. I'm not going on like this. Someday you'll come home and not find me here." "You're too smart for that, Rachel," East said coldly. "You'll never leave me and live. You know too much, baby, and don't forget it." She went white at his threat, then without a word walked out of the room. Gumbo waited a minute, and when he heard the door slam, he stepped out of the closet. "She knew I was there, East." Chastain gestured impatiently. "She believes what I tell her. She better. He peeled off his pajamas and crossed to a row of drawers. Gumbo sat on the edge of the bed while the other dressed. "I ought to have an outfit like you," he suggested. East glanced at him. "I haven't made up my mind yet," he said. "I'll get another opinion." He finished his toilet. "Come on, let's go." Gumbo shrugged and got to his feet. The scotch had hit his empty stomach hard. He followed the gambler out of the house without question. It didn't make any difference to Gumbo where they were going. It was a long, lithe coupe, and East drove slowly. There was no talk. Long habit had taught Gumbo Wire the futility of thinking when the decision was out of his hands, so he interested himself in the machine. Automobiles had changed considerably since he had been salted away, and he marveled at the silence of the motor and the sense of vast power in reserve. They swung into a tree-shaded side street near the Civic Center, and East slowed down. "I need time to think it over," he mused. "Meanwhile, I'll cash you in a private spot with some friends of mine. Don't let too many people in on this, East. This is one pair I can trust." East eased the big car up to the curb before an apartment house. Gumbo sat tight until East gave him the nod. Then they both got out, and East keyed open the front door, and they went into the building. A self-operated elevator conveyed them to the 5th floor. Gumbo grinned inwardly. He had a pretty good idea of where they were going. They walked down a carpeted hallway to the last door. East played a brief tattoo on the buzzer. There was a long pause. Then the door opened to the width of the stop chain, and a battered, sleepy face appeared in the crack. East said, "It's me, Dunbar. Open up." The man blinked confusedly. "Oh, hiya, Chief," he mumbled, and let them in. He stood with his back to the closed door, a worried look on his broken face. He put Gumbo in mind of a groggy St. Bernard pup. He knew the type, a broken-down wrestler who had had his head squeezed and pounded once too often. Now, in rumpled pajamas much too small for him, he resembled nothing quite so much as a great, slow-witted ape. Gumbo felt sorry for him, without quite knowing why. "Where's Patty?" snapped East. "I want to talk with her." He waved Gumbo into a chair and started for the next room. The man called Dunbar looked owlishly at Gumbo for a moment, then padded hurriedly after East. The door closed behind them. Gumbo chuckled and stretched out in an easy chair. He bounced up and down to test it, like a kid, then opening an inlaid box of an end table, chose a cigarette. There was an open box of chocolates nearby, so he stuffed a couple in his mouth. Now if he could just navigate this next hurdle. He drew the smoke into his lungs and stared about him. It was a flashy apartment, furnished for lazing. The chairs were deep and the lights shaded. A studio piano stood across one corner with a lot of cheap music on the rack. The smell slapped Gumbo right in the nose. A blend of perfume, liquor, and tobacco smoke. Boy, thought Gumbo, there's nothing subtle about this setup. The other door opened eventually, and East came out with the girl. Dunbar stumbled behind them like a faithful dog. Gumbo started to rise, then changed his mind and stayed out. East and the girl stood together, staring at him so long it was his turn to feel like a dog. A mutt at a bench show. Well, she was smoother than Gumbo expected, and much better looking. She had a heart-shaped face, marred by makeup, and a little on the soft side, like an overripe peach. Her copper-colored hair was piled high on her head with small ringlets. Mascara outlined eyes that might have been green. Gumbo couldn't be sure in the diffused light. Her lips were full, especially the lower one. Her figure was encased in a pale green hostess gown. "Well," East asked finally, "what do you think?" "Nice," Gumbo grinned. "Very nice." East frowned. "I wasn't talking to you," he snapped. "Could be," the girl said, nodding. "It'll take a lot of work, but the resemblance is remarkable." East took a chair opposite to Gumbo. "Let's squat," he suggested. The girl curled up on a couch to one side of Gumbo so she could study him without meeting his eyes. She carried such a load of perfume he could have located her in a blackout. Dunbar settled himself anxiously on the edge of the chair. "Now let's go over this deal," East began. "I'm still not sold, but we'll give it a whirl for a day or two. Let's make sure we understand each other. Gumbo, you're to do exactly as I tell you." "Check." "You couldn't fool a blind man right now. Maybe Patty here can coach you enough to get by. She's an actress. For the time being, you'll stay here until I can find a suitable hideout for you." "Suits me," grinned Gumbo. "You'll have to get rid of that prison pallor and take on a little weight." A sun lamp and a few meals will fix that. East rose to his feet. Dunbar'll loan you a razor. Patty'll show you where to bunk. I'll see you tomorrow. He turned to the ex-wrestler. Slip on a shirt and pants, Dunbar. I want you to drive over to the house with me and get some clothes for this rummy. You can bring the car back here. Oh, hell, Chief, whined the big man. Can't that wait until— Oh, shut up and do like East asks you, snapped the girl. I'll wait up for you. As the big lout shuffled into the other room, the girl winked at East. Gumbo saw this and saw the slow, knowing smile that touched East's lips. Probably a good thing the poor sap's a little slug nutty, he reflected. Well, it was none of his business. Not that. Chapter 3. When East and Dunbar had gone, Gumbo went back to his easy chair and lighted another cigarette. The girl kept staring at him, so he scrunched around until he could meet her eyes. He was afraid of her, in a way. A wacky woman like this could wreck the best of plans. As old Beau had remarked, there's always a woman. He'd have to play along with her, but not play too hard. It wasn't ethics, but he knew how East Chastain felt about her. She was dynamite. Whose idea was this? She asked finally. Mine. Why? Watch her, boy. She's smart. Gumbo smiled. What did East tell you? Enough. Well, I guess you know all there is to know. She lit a fresh smoke from the butt of the old one. In the silence, Gumbo began to sweat. He stood it as long as he could. How about some food? I haven't eaten for years. She didn't move. Kitchen's over there. I'm not going to wait on you. Gumbo slapped his knees and stood up. Fair enough, Mabel. I'll scramble some eggs. Have some? She stared at him in silence. So he sauntered on out to the kitchen. It was small and modern, with a tiny breakfast alcove adjoining. In the refrigerator, he found eggs, a few slices of bacon, and a quart of milk. He was humming softly over the frying pan when he glanced over his shoulder to find her watching him from the doorway. Change your mind, he asked. Her eyes were green. Where did you get that Mabel stuff? Slip of the tongue, he grinned. I'd forgotten you changed your handle. She slid onto a seat in the nook so she could see his face. East didn't tell you that, Gumbo. He never mentioned you. Give, Gumbo. He laughed. I'm a cross between an elephant and a clam. I never forget and seldom talk. Forget hell, she snapped irritably. You never saw me before. I never saw Europe, but I know about it. Go on, Gumbo. He mangled the eggs with a fork. It's coming to me. Slowly, slowly, he said, imitating a mystic. The voices tell me you were born Mabel Jobble, on the other side of the tracks. You were always smart. No matter how hard they threw you, you landed on your feet, with coins stuck between your toes. I see you trying to crash Hollywood and landing in burlesque. He turned the heat off and poured a glass of milk. But that was too much work. So you married a penny ante bootlegger named Haynes. When he died of lead poisoning, judiciously administered in the gut, you had already established contact with the bright boys in the blue chips. 2 years ago, you marked East. But he was married, and so to get next to him, you married old Dunbar Hammerstein, East's bodyguard. I suppose it complicates things somewhat to have the big clown in love with you, but you're smart enough to handle that. The voices fade now, he laughed. How am I doing, babe? Anything else? Gumbo shrugged. Only that you're still a pin-up gal to some of the old-timers in San Jacinto. She crushed out her cigarette. I've changed my mind, she muttered. Deal me a round of eggs, Gumbo. He set a plate before her and divided the eggs. He emptied a glass of milk to lay a foundation on his empty stomach, then sat down across from her. No hard feelings, Mabel? No, only the name is Patty. Milk Patty? She shook her head. I'll take scotch. She toyed with their food, not eating it. Then, you're not much like East. Coming from you, Patty, that's a slam, he grinned. Not necessarily. I just can't make up my mind about you is all. He got up and brought her some scotch from the other room. After pouring her a stiff jolt, he took a glass of the stuff himself. The food upset him a little, and he resisted the temptation to gorge himself. The girl said nothing during the meal. But when he had finished and relaxed his cigarette and drink, she suggested, Level off, Gumbo. What's your angle? He wondered if she was asking this for East, or if she was putting on the bite for herself. She was about as trustworthy as a hungry cobra, and he sensed she was a little afraid of him. Perhaps he had said too much. She wasn't any chicken, in her 30s at least, and she was riding high. If she lost this berth, there wouldn't be much between her and the pavements. She wouldn't stop at anything to hold what she had. It shouldn't be hard for you to understand, Patty. I just want to live. That's about all. I want to see something besides gray walls, gray clothes, and gray men. I want to eat like this when I'm hungry, wear colored clothing, smoke tailor-mades, hear doors that slam and not clank. He smiled a little. And I want to be able to sit and talk with a beautiful woman, like you, Patty, and smell perfume. That, to me, is living. She pursed her lips. How long do you think you can get away with it? She asked abruptly. Well, that depends on a lot of things. You were sent up for murder. Gumbo's face went hard. That's what I was sent up for. Trying to make me believe you were innocent? Gumbo shook his head. I'm not trying to make you believe anything. Lord, you're hard, she shivered. Hard as nails. You'd kill a man with your bare hands. That's right. There's a couple I hope to get before long. Tell me about it, Gumbo. Her green eyes started to dilate until he wondered if she was a snowbird. This is getting lopsided, he grumbled. How about me asking a few? Try me. Okay. Let's start off with Marco. He's still the DA? She nodded. Of course. With the machine in, he'll have the berth as long as he wants it and does what he's told. He sent you up, didn't he, Gumbo? Gumbo nodded. The rest of the setup is it, I suppose. Her green eyes flickered. Patty shrugged. The only change in the last 5 or 6 years came when Nolan died, and they put Murphy in as chief of police. He's only a figurehead, of course. Howard is still head of the vice squad and runs the department. Cantrell is mayor. I guess that covers it. Old Judge Taylor's still on the bench. Uh-huh. Funny old buzzard. She laughed, but stopped short at the look on Gumbo's face. East should be doing all right with all these yokels from the Midwest floating into the region. Oh, he has his troubles. Right now it's a mug named Jake Schultz, an ex-labor racketeer. He's setting up a chain of cheap dives to milk all the new people coming to town. East never kidded around with that kind of traffic. He doesn't like it, Patty said. He's paid Howard for the whole concession. She frowned as if she had said too much. Now, let's talk about you, Gumbo. Gumbo drained his glass and poured himself another. A warm glow was stealing over him, and he felt deliciously weary. He knew he'd had enough, for he couldn't risk getting tied around a woman like this. He pushed his glass away. That's very simple, he said at last. A few years ago, I believed in Santa Claus. After a stretch in the stir, I don't. That's all. You're not playing fair. Why were you sent up? Howard and Marco said it was murder. But was it? Technically, yes. Her eyes burned into him. He knew he should stop talking now, for he was already a little drunk. But suddenly he was overwhelmed with loneliness, and he wanted more than anything else to unburden himself. Her nearness was drugging him. What the hell, he thought, and raised the glass to his lips. Was it a girl, Gumbo? He set the drink down, and the lines of bitterness deepened his face. Isn't it always? He growled. But that's no part of the story. Not directly. I'd worked all summer and had a role. It wasn't enough to do what I wanted with, so I tried to double it in a game. It was a crooked game. Later, in a bar, I got to talking too much. A guy I knew slightly told me that he'd been cleaned by the outfit and said he was going to strong-arm his dough back. He asked me to drive the car. Well, he didn't say anything about a gun, and I didn't think to ask. I was a little tight anyhow. Gumbo sighed, emptied his glass. So, that's how it was. They said he killed a cop. I didn't see him. I was sitting in a car downstairs. They swept my name out of him and said he hung himself in a cell. Maybe he did, but I think Howard beat him to death. Anyhow, I was the goat. They stuck me for technical murder and pinned a dozen other stick-ups onto me in the bargain. Shaughnessy, my lawyer, told me to cop a plea, that he had had a drag with Marco and would get the jolt lowered to manslaughter. He double-crossed me. Old Judge Taylor was in on the play, so he threw the book at me, and I was salted away for keeps. Patty started outlining her mouth with lipstick. Gumbo watched her and felt his eyes smart. He wanted badly to be believed, but hated himself for caring. You were crazy to come back to this same town, Gumbo. You're probably right. She leaned towards him and saw the shadows under her chin. Look, Gumbo, why don't you run? If you're broke, why, I've got a little money. Gumbo grinned. Let's string along with East. I won't hurt your game, whatever it is. And yours? Gumbo stood up, a trifle unsteadily. This is where I come in, he grinned. Let's not sit through the newsreel again. He chuckled at the flush that darkened her features. Where do I sleep? She flounced across the apartment and showed him the spare bedroom. He was undressing when he heard Dunbar key his way into the apartment. After that, the murmur of voices. He couldn't hear what was being said as he drifted off to sleep. Gumbo floated back to consciousness around noon. It was hard to believe he was actually in a real bed with clean sheets. He lay still, flexing his toes, liking the feel of it. After a time, he rose and raised the shades, then stripped in the rectangle of warm sunshine. He peeked into the living room. There was no sign of either Dunbar or his wife, but on a chair was a brown suit with a pinstripe, brown pebble-grain shoes, shirt, underwear, ties, and socks. Gumbo patted out and retrieved them. Then he went into the shower. He took his time, enjoying every moment of it. He found a razor and accessories, and after shaving, doused his face and body with cologne. He was lacing his shoes when someone knocked. He jerked up, facing the door, feeling again the old tension. The knock was repeated. Then Patty's voice. Gumbo, you up? Sure. I can't wait breakfast all day, mister. Come and get it. Patty was humming around, dressed in a short gingham house dress. There was only one place set at the table. Don't you eat? Have done with Dunbar. He's gone over to get East with the car, so you'd better get busy. She waved him to a seat. I thought you'd like waffles and sausage for a change. Gumbo rubbed his hands. It'd be a change, all right. My God, you're an accomplished wench. You forget I'm married. Not me, babe. I forget nothing. Tell me, do I look like East Chastain in the mornings, or don't you know? She studied him intently. No, I can't say that you do. East wakes up bloodshot with sacks of coal under each eye, but I could make you up to look like that. As he was eating, he tried to figure her out. Gumbo was no psychologist, yet he reasoned that she possessed a multiple personality. One facet was as diamond tough and ruthless as only a hard woman can be, but she had a softer side and a wealth of understanding that might bridge the gap. The same life that had made of her a chiseler had also made her human. It made her dangerous, too. Maybe she was the wild joker in this game which he had cut himself into. After his second cup of coffee, she said briskly, Okay, Gumbo, let's get to work. East expects miracles in a hell of a hurry. Otherwise, she shrugged. Well, Tip Howard's still around the corner. He crushed his smoke. I'm ready when you are. Well, let's start with that cigarette, the girl suggested. East doesn't handle it that way. He sort of squashes it between his long, restless fingers. Like this. See? She demonstrated with her own butt. Gumbo imitated the motion, and she nodded her approval. You learn quick. Don't I, though? She colored a little. And don't be so damn fast with your comebacks. East is always the gambler, and he never steps out of character. He keeps a deadpan, thinks over everything he's going to say, and doesn't telegraph his thoughts like you do. You're still an open-faced kid, Gumbo. Thanks. How's this? He made a long, horsey face and pretended to crush a cigarette. Patty shrilled gaily. They were both laughing when East and Dunbar walked in on them. Having fun? East asked dryly. They turned and stared at him in unison. His dead expression was so much like Gumbo's imitation that they burst out laughing again. East didn't even smile. Patty sprang out of her seat. Oh, Easty, you should see the idiot trying to be like you. He's a riot. Dunbar leaned against the door, watching, but East scaled his hat onto the couch and sat down. Go into your act, Gumbo, he said. Gumbo Wire walked over to another chair and flopped down exactly as East had done. Go into your act, Gumbo, he parroted in the same flat tone. East permitted himself a dry smile. Not bad. I suppose it's funnier to someone else. He touched the tips of his fingers together and scowled a little as Gumbo continued to imitate him. I ran into Howard this morning. You're a liar, Gumbo thought. You looked him up deliberately. He waited. East took his time. Howard mentioned you, Gumbo. He doesn't agree with the prison officials that you've drowned. He looked up your school record and found that you were a crack swimmer. I'll have to kill Howard sooner than I expected, Gumbo told himself. Aloud, he said, Hell, he's just on a fishing expedition, that's all. East shrugged. I don't know. Howard's plenty smart. I can't afford to cross him. I'd about decided not to go ahead with this crazy deal, Gumbo. Gumbo's heart skipped a beat, but he forced his eyes to meet the other's steady gaze, tried to keep his own expression as inscrutable as East's. This was a squeeze play, and he had to see East's hand. However, East went on finally, I'm a gambler, and I'll always take a chance, if the stakes make it worthwhile. He rolled his head and glanced at the girl. How about it, Patty? Can you have him ready for a premiere by Saturday? Patty looked startled. My God, Easty, this is Thursday already. That doesn't give us much time. Then you better stick a little closer to business and make it good. Gumbo didn't like the odor. What's the job, East? Scared? No, just curious. East pushed to his feet. You'll play the cards as I deal them, he reminded Gumbo. But I'll give you this much of a tip. Muff this play, and there won't be a second chance. Ever. Understand? Gumbo winced inside, but held his ground. This looked like a beautiful frame to brush him off. Howard, East, Marco, Taylor. God, he'd been a sucker to think he could buck that machine. Understand? Repeated East. Perfectly, said Gumbo Wire. East looked at Dunbar. I won't need you today, chum. You stay here. Pick me up tonight about 9. Okie dokie, Chief. When East had gone, the big ape slumped wearily into a chair and groped for a cigarette. He studied Gumbo intently, as if trying to make up his mind whether to resent him or not. Gumbo grinned pleasantly. He keeps you busy, eh, pal? Dunbar said, yeah, and it seemed to cost him an effort. Patty crossed over and sat at the edge of his chair. She brushed his forehead with her painted lips, and the wrinkles vanished. Now, darling, she said lightly, you sit there while I train Gumbo. You'll be a great help, for you understand East so perfectly. Sure, he said. Chapter 4. Saturday night was foggy, for which Danny Gumbo offered up a little prayer of thanks. Despite the brief time that they had had, Patty said he was ready. And after a dress rehearsal in the little apartment Saturday evening, East thought so too. Gumbo had nearly burned off his hide under a sun lamp, but at least it took away the prison pallor and gave him the semblance of a tan. Sitting around the place, eating chocolate creams and drinking malted milks had filled him out a little. He slipped out to a little corner joint and got a haircut like East's, and because he couldn't grow a full mustache in the time allotted, East cut his own down to the same trim as Gumbo's. Patty swore she couldn't tell them apart, and East threatened to cut her gullet if she made a mistake. He laughed when he said it, and the girl took it as a gag, but Gumbo wasn't fooled. East already hated him, and he wasn't sure just why. The deal involved the ex-racketeer, Jake Schultz, whom Patty had spoken of the first night. Jake had organized all the cheap joints for the migrants, and while it didn't cut into the high-class trade East Chastain was working, East resented it. He further suspected that Captain Howard was covering Jake, at the same time that he was selling protection and the exclusive gambling concession to East. He had learned that the sugar was turned in at Jake's headquarters in an urban nightclub every Sunday morning about 2 a.m. He wanted Gumbo to heist the joint at the same time, not only to grab the money, but so he could find out how big a take there was in the migrant traffic. It sounded to Gumbo like sheer suicide. That kind of money would be well gunned. But East reasoned that since he was a known friend of Jake's and had often dropped in to visit him at the club, that Gumbo could get past the Rodman. After that, it was up to him. But suppose I do fool him into thinking it's you, Gumbo argued. That puts you behind the 8-ball. East smiled. Don't worry about me. I've got a little date with the right kind of witnesses. Well, they better be good, Gumbo grunted. The best. When you take the joint, I'll be sitting in the back room at police headquarters with Tip Howard and Jake Schultz. Gumbo whistled admiringly. You're smart, East. Wait a minute, the girl cut in. Suppose Gumbo fumbles. Well, that's just too bad, East said. What difference does it make to you anyhow? None. But then keep your damn nose out of my business, he snapped at her. Gumbo got red around the neck, but kept his mouth shut. East glanced back at the clock. It was after midnight. He took a gun out of his pocket and, after carefully wiping his own prints off, handed it to Gumbo. Try not to kill anybody, if you can help it. You think of everything, don't you? Gumbo said grimly. Everything, East grinned and got up. Come on, Dunbar'll drive you near enough to the joint to hike. It was just 1:30 when East drove up in front of police headquarters. He left Dunbar sitting in the car and sauntered into the station house. He paused for a word with the young desk sergeant, then he walked on through the detective bureau to the airless little room behind the captain's office. Howard was tilted back in his swivel chair with his tremendous feet resting on the desk. Schultz sat facing the door. He had a trick of seeming to carry the weight of his barrel-bellied torso on his elbows. "Hello, boys," said East. He pushed his hat back and dropped into the vacant chair. They both said hello, and Howard nodded at the glasses on the desk. "We drinking beer?" he observed. "There's scotch if you want it." "Beer's good enough," said East pleasantly, and as Howard reached down for the glass, East glanced at Schultz. "How's business, Jake?" "So-so." Howard opened another quart and filled the glasses. East watched him, thinking what a queer duck he was. Tip Howard was like a delayed action bomb. He never did anything just when you expected it, but when he did go off, he was deadly. He didn't look deadly, though. He was a big man with a placid, ruddy face and red dewlips. Slow-moving, and perhaps a trifle slow-witted. One couldn't be sure. He spoke very little, and never about his thoughts. Somewhere in his middle 50s, his hair was thin and gray, and his eyes were gray and veiled. Despite his mild appearance, he was brutal, and so crooked as to be unmoral rather than immoral. He had been a harness hole for 10 years, and had managed to buy 2 apartment houses and an office building in that period. Since taking over the Vice Squad, not even East Chastain could guess his income. "Well, let's talk business," Jake said aggressively. "I got work to do yet tonight. This get-together was your idea, East. What's your beef?" Howard watched East, and his eyes brightened with amusement. East set his glass down and revolved it with his long fingers. He was in no hurry to terminate the meeting, nor had he any intention of letting Jake stampede him. He appraised the man thoughtfully, enjoying the other's restlessness, feeling contempt for his lack of control. Jake Schultz was out of his element, and perhaps he knew it. He was an organizer, not a gambler. He was a squat, powerful man with a blowtorch personality who was accustomed to getting his way through sheer bluster. Now his beef squad strong-arm methods put him at a disadvantage, but it was all he knew. He lowered forward in his chair, gnawing on a cold butt of a cigar. "We might as well be realistic," he said finally. "You're taking in too much territory, Jake." Schultz swelled his chest. This was something he could understand. A threat, perhaps. "It's a free country," he growled. "Interesting," East observed acidly. "I hadn't found it free. It cost me plenty of sugar." He glanced sideways at Howard, but the big cop had the same bland look. "Okay," barked Schultz. "Let's get down to cases. You've been here 10 years, East. In that time, you never made a dime out of the small fry. So what's it to you?" "I was busy." "You're still busy," snapped Jake. "You get the cream. What in the hell you want to be? A dog in the manger?" "Don't shout," East said. "Who's shouting?" yelled Jake. "Cut out the high and mighty stuff, Chastain. You ain't dealing with no damn kid. If you want to make something of it, all you got to do—" "Oh, for God's sake, hold your wind," East drawled. "You're not organizing some Bronx truck drivers." Jake reared half out of his chair, but Howard motioned him back. "All right, East," he said with a deceptive gentleness. "Wind up your argument." East stalled. The setup was perfect, and he wanted to keep it like this. Jake was ready to blow his top, and Howard, well, Howard was still astride the fence as usual, perhaps a trifle more needling. "The trouble is," East went on softly, "I'm paying plenty for the gambling concession. San Carlos can't stand 2 of us from now on." "Why in the hell can't it?" fumed Jake. "You got your swells, I got the rabble. What's your squawk?" East controlled himself. "Are you paying off too?" "Suppose you stick to your case, East," interposed Howard. "That's part of it. There's got to be a change." He paused as the telephone jangled harshly. Howard scooped it up, said, "Detective Bureau, Howard talking." "Oh yeah, he's right here." He pushed the instrument toward Schultz. "It's for you, Jake." Jake took the phone. "Well?" East, watching him lazily, saw the color drain from Jake's florid face, then sweep back with the rush that brought the veins throbbing in his forehead. The man's eyes appeared to start out of his head. "What? Who? Who?" Jake glared across the desk at East. "Why, are you crazy? He's sitting right here with me." "Sure, I know what I'm talking about. By God, you dumb sap, sit tight. I'll be right out." He slammed the receiver on its prong and stood up. He looked up, about ready for a stroke. "What the hell am I paying you for?" he snouted at Howard. Howard locked his hands across his paunch. "What's up?" he asked mildly. East was delighted. He knew the truth now. Howard was double-crossing him. And Gumbo Wire? The kid had made it. "My joint was heisted," raged Jake. "The boys said it was East." He swung around and glared at Chastain. "Go on. Say it," East urged. "I wouldn't put it past you," Jake challenged him. East grinned and looked at Howard. The old cop was watching him with that same fish, cold flatness. East had trouble keeping the color out of his own features. "Out of my line," he remarked. "Perhaps I better check my own joint." And he got up. Jake crushed his hat on. "You coming with me, Cap?" Howard shook his head. "Nah," he said indolently. "I'll play my own angles. Let me know what you find, Jake." East said, "I'm sorry, Jake." "Yeah, I bet you are," snarled Schultz, and stomped out of the office. Howard carefully rinsed the glasses in the wash basin and put them back in his desk drawer. "Funny," he mused. "We ain't had a stick-up since—" he paused. "For about 5 years. Funny. I'll shove off," he said. "We'll settle this business some other time. Night, Tip." Howard looked at him. "Night, East. Be careful." After leaving headquarters, East made Dunbar move over and took the wheel himself. With the big fella watching out the rear window, East drove around to the block several times to make sure they weren't being tailed. Howard had disconcerted him more than he cared to admit, even to himself. He had the uncomfortable sensation that Tip Howard had read his mind, and it came to him that sooner or later he and the big cop were going to clash. It was not a pleasant prospect. Although he had maintained a business relationship with Howard for years, he had no illusions. If and when Howard wearied of the arrangement, it would be terminated in his own peculiar fashion, and Tip Howard invariably left no strings to tangle his future. When East was satisfied that no one followed him, he sent Dunbar to the apartment in a cab and drove slowly along the Bayshore Road alone. There were a few cars out, and because the fog had thickened, he straddled the white line. Driving slowly, his mind turned from Howard to Gumbo Wire. He was surprised, in a way, that the kid had succeeded. Still, East wasn't sure he liked the deal. He had never toyed with strong-arm stuff, and he despised guns. Once or twice in his career, he had been forced to remove some particularly obnoxious character, but on those occasions, he had left the actual work to specialists. He smiled slightly, thinking about it. Perhaps Jake Schultz could be cataloged as an obnoxious character. Gumbo versus Jake? The thing had possibilities. He pulled into an all-night hash house and parked the car in a shadowed spot behind a group of trucks. Inside the restaurant, he found a group of truck drivers and a couple of sailors. He drank a cup of coffee and then stepped into the telephone booth and called Patty. "Everything dropped into the slots, baby," he told her. "Wonderful. You see him yet, honey?" she asked breathlessly. "Not yet, but we'll be home in half an hour." She hesitated. "Dunbar with you, Easty Lamb?" "I sent him home in a cab. He should be there in a minute. How about rustling up some chow, baby? We'll have a party of sorts. You know I'd like to, Easty. I'll make rare bit if you'll pick up some ale." "Okay. Get things ready. I'm on my way." He bought a couple bottles of beer and went out to the machine. As he tooled it out of the drive, he turned his head. "You there?" Gumbo Wire straightened himself from the crouch behind the front seat and climbed in beside him. "It went off like silk," Gumbo said. "How much?" Gumbo shrugged and fished through his pockets for a smoke. "Couldn't count it," he admitted, "but the boys intimated it was close to 8,000. Not bad pickings, East, eh?" Chastain grunted. "I didn't think those damned Okies made that kind of dough. No wonder this war is costing us so much." "That's a laugh," Gumbo grinned, "coming from you, East." East drove slowly as they passed the city limits. He had a bad moment when a police prowl car slowed alongside of him, but the cops recognized the car and went on by. "It was a dumb trick for both of us to ride like this," he grumbled. "Hell," laughed Gumbo. The dumb cops would think they were seeing double. Not Howard. Gumbo stopped smiling. Perhaps you better tell me exactly what happened to you tonight, he suggested. Can't tell you when I might need to know. Why? Just a hunch. No harm in it, is there? I guess not. But if you met up with Howard, it wouldn't do you much good to know. You couldn't fool him, Gumbo. Don't try. Suit yourself, but you sound smug, so it must have gone off all right. East chuckled. It did. Beautifully. He told Gumbo what had taken place. Then, Gumbo, tell me, did you ever kill a man? I was sent up for murder. That's not what I asked you. The answer is no. He waited, expecting East to enlarge on the subject, but the gambler said no more. They drove into East's private garage behind the apartment house, and East went up first. Gumbo waited about 10 minutes and followed with a bag of money. While the girl was cooking the rare bit, East counted the money. Gumbo had left most of the silver because it was too heavy, but there was a nice pile of green stuff. It totaled a little over $7,500. What for? What's the idea? Growled East. Gumbo shrugged. The poor Down'll catch enough hell from Jake and probably lose his job. I'll be damned. He's got a sick wife, Gumbo said grimly. Dunbar said, gee, but East was sore. Look, Robin Hood, after this don't be so damn generous with my dough. How to win friends and influence people, Gumbo grinned. If you don't like it, take it out of my cut. Your cut? My cut. Who took the sugar? East smiled, but it lacked mirth. Okay. He peeled off a sheaf of greenbacks. Here, this'll hold you for now. Gumbo rolled the money without looking at it and shoved it into his pocket. From the kitchen, Patty called, Hurry up, boys. Everything's set. Ain't it the truth, chuckled Gumbo. It was nearly noon when Gumbo walked into the living room. Nobody was about. He opened the window to wash out the hangover stench of stale smoke and liquor and emptied the ashtrays. The dirty plates were still on the table, so Gumbo stacked them in the sink and made some coffee. By the time it had perked, Patty walked into the kitchen. She'd looked like the wrath of God. Without the benefit of makeup, she showed her age. She collapsed into a corner of the nook, moaning softly. Get me a drink, will you, Lammy? More of the dog or black Java? Oh, Lord, I don't care. She sat with her head propped up on her hands. Boy, oh boy, what a party we had after you turned in. Where's East and hubby? We drank Dunbar under the table, quick. He's still out, sleeping. He can't take it. He stuck around. She made a grimace. That wife of his. Gumbo glanced at her. It was the first time she had mentioned Mrs. Chastain in his presence, and he was curious as to how she felt about East's wife. Rachel kicking up her heels? Patty gulped some of the coffee he placed before her. Uh-huh, a clinging vine. She's just a kid, Gumbo commented. I saw her. Nice, too. If you like the type, jeered the girl. Hand me a cigarette like a love. Gumbo lit one for her off his own. Is that like a love? Patty burst into laughter. You're a card, Gumbo. She tried to look coy and looked silly instead. Sit down beside me and tell me what happened last night. I'm all a-twitter. Gumbo dropped into a seat with the table between them. She leaned back on her arms. Gumbo, how much money was there in that bag? I didn't count it. He didn't like the look in her eyes. Well, she was East's problem, not his. He talked to forestall any more questions, telling her the humorous side of the heist. When he told of giving the $500 to old Joe, she leaned forward and studied him intently. East didn't like that, she told him. But I did. It was white, Gumbo. You're a soft-hearted sucker. I put the guy on the spot, Gumbo said. It was the least I could do. And I said you were hard. My God, a sentimental kid. It'll get you in trouble someday. A knock on the door made her jump. She said, oh, damn, and walked across the room. Gumbo heaved a sigh and lit another smoke. He was shaking out the match when she opened the door. Captain Howard walked into the apartment. Chapter 5. Gumbo was trapped in the breakfast nook. He put his hands on the table and stared as Captain Howard sauntered across the living room towards him. The girl was petrified. She leaned against the door, bent over slightly as though she had had a cramp, and without makeup, the terror turned her face the color of stale dough. But Howard wasn't looking at her. He was watching Gumbo. He thumbed his hat back from his face, grinned, and said, "Hello, East." 4 years in prison had taught Gumbo wire to control his expression. He needed that control now. He managed a slow smile, like East's, and gestured to a seat at the other end of the table. "Sit down, Tip. Drink?" He wondered if Howard drank in the middle of the day. Lord, there was a hell of a lot of things a guy had to know to play double for somebody else. "Coffee if you have it ready," Howard said, dropping into the chair. Gumbo looked on past Howard to where Patty was standing with bated breath. He gave her a reassuring grin. "Come on, honey," he called. "Pour us around." To Howard, he added, "She hates to be caught without her face on." "Yeah," Howard said. "They're all the same." There was a nasty pause. Gumbo had a hard time to keep from fidgeting, and he was grateful that the light from the window at his back fell full on Howard's face, yet kept his own in shadow. Well, he needed all the breaks he could get. Howard might as well have been wearing a veil for all Gumbo could make of his expression. Patty was fumbling around trying to get the coffee going and making heavy weather of it. Gumbo began to squirm. "Well," he asked finally, "you find anything?" Howard shrugged. "I work slowly, as you know." Gumbo chuckled. "Did I rough up Jake too much last night, Tip?" "When?" "What do you mean, when? That beer didn't go to your head, did it?" "Oh, no, I just thought maybe you'd seen him again after that." Gumbo shook his head. Fortunately, Patty brought the warmed-over coffee along. Gumbo took out a cigarette and stuck it in his mouth. Howard watched him, then said, "How about one, East?" The Lord must have had his arms around Gumbo just then, for as he was about to hand over the pack, something made him glance up. Patty was standing behind Howard, vigorously shaking her head. Gumbo took his cue. "You gonna start bad habits, Tip?" Howard smiled. "Just an impulse. I used to smoke them things when I was a kid." But he didn't take one. "When you was a kid," thought Gumbo, "your mother should have bitten you to death and kept one of the other pups." Howard drank his coffee, then pushed back the cup. "What I dropped in for, East," he told Gumbo, "was to warn you about Jake. I don't want no trouble here in San Carlos. There's a new grand jury going in and might cause a stink if they got something to bite on. They won't if I can help it." "Well, you better tell that to Jake," Gumbo said. "He's the troublemaking kind, not me." "Oh, yeah? I've talked to Jake. He'll behave." "Then you've got no worries, Tip. Except," Gumbo grinned. "Except?" "We're paying you too much dough. You'll only have trouble with your income tax." Howard looked thoughtful. "I didn't realize you had such a sense of humor, East." He mused, and Gumbo could have kicked himself. He'd overplayed his hand. Howard got up and started across the living room to the hall door. Gumbo followed, holding his breath. Patty sat in a deep chair, nursing a cup of coffee with both hands. "Thanks for the drink, Mrs. Hammerstein," Howard said. Patty murmured, "'Tis pleasure. Sure." The cup rattled against the saucer. Howard had almost reached the front door when Dunbar Hammerstein came out of the bedroom. Gumbo's heart did a couple of backflips and then began to hop round his chest like a fish on a pier. "Well, this is it," he sighed, and wondered vaguely if anyone had ever dived out a 5-story window and lived. Dunbar stopped short at the sight of the cop. "Hi, Mr. Howard." He turned his squat head towards Gumbo, and every eye in the room was on him. "Morning, Chief. Did I keep you waiting?" Gumbo's legs went weak with relief. "No hurry. Patty brewed up a pot of coffee. I'm ready when you are." Howard smiled thinly. "Well, be seeing you, East. Take care of yourself, Hammerstein." "Okey doke," mumbled Dunbar as Howard went out. When the door closed and they heard the elevator go down, Gumbo fell backwards into a chair and lay limp. "Boy, oh boy," he panted. "Another minute of that, and I'd have thrown in the sponge." "You would have?" snapped the girl. "I did." Gumbo stared at the hulking figure of the ex-wrestler. "Pal, I love you. How the hell did you carry it off so smooth?" Dunbar stared down at him a long time with those small, quizzical eyes. "I'm not so stupid as I look," he growled, and walked into the kitchen. Gumbo pursed his lips. "That's a point to remember, chum," he told himself. Patty was half crying. "Do you think he knew you weren't East?" I only hope to hell he doesn't run into East before I do, Gumbo said. He acted awful funny, she persisted. That trick of asking you for a cigarette? He doesn't smoke anything but cigars. It shows he was suspicious. Gumbo scratched his neck. He was suspicious, but I don't know. He didn't want to tell her he had decided that Howard must be killed, and soon. He'd play that single-handed. Well, quit worrying about it, he growled. Call East on the phone and tell him. Call him yourself, she bit back. I won't talk to that wife of his. Gumbo got the number and called East Chastain's house. While he was waiting for the answer, Patty said sharply, Don't give this number, whatever you do. Just then, Rachel Chastain came on the other end of the line. Gumbo asked if East was there. No, she said. East is out. The sound of her voice brought to Gumbo's mind the vision of her as he had first seen her. It's important, Gumbo said. Do you know where I can reach him? I'm sorry, she said, but I haven't any idea where he is. If you care to leave your number, he may call. Gumbo glanced at Patty. Never mind, he told Rachel. I'll try again. He hung up, scowling. Dunbar came over. That Mrs. Chastain's a real nice lady, he observed heavily. A nosy, screamed Patty, but before she could finish her epitaph, Dunbar reached down and gripped her shoulder. Gumbo saw her wince with pain, and her face whitened in terror. He didn't know what to do. Mrs. Chastain is a nice lady, repeated the big man, slowly, like a child repeating a lesson. Let me go, you crazy ape, whined the girl. Dunbar took his hand off her and walked over to the door. He was shaken all over. Patty was blubbering in her chair. Gumbo pushed to his feet. We got to find East, and quick. Anybody got an idea? Dunbar's battered face wrinkled in concentration. He might be anywhere, he muttered. Well, it's a cinch I can't go looking for him, growled Gumbo. You two will have to go. When Patty glared up at him, he stared her down. You too, Patty. We're in this together, whether we like it or not. In what? Dunbar answered that one. I guess we'll get into trouble over an escaped con living here, huh? That's part of it. Patty jerked out of her chair. I knew you'd cause trouble, she stared at Gumbo. A lousy con. She flounced into the bedroom and came out a little later dressed for the street. Come on, she flung at Dunbar. He shook his head. You try the clubs and cafes, Dunbar told her. I'll hit the back joints. We can call in here. I'll squat over the telephone, Gumbo assured them, but keep away from Howard. Patty gave him a look of contempt. Oh, yeah, she sneered and stalked out. Dunbar hesitated as though he wanted to say something to Gumbo. Then he changed his slow-witted mind and tagged after his wife. Danny Gumbo never spent such a day. The worst session in the dungeon at San Jacinto was a picnic to this. He paced around the tiny apartment like a caged tiger, which, in a sense, he was. He cursed himself, East, and Patty. He cursed San Carlos and the impulse that had drawn him back. He knew now that he had been a chump to think he could carry on this masquerade. And Howard? It was inconceivable that he had been fooled. But if Howard had known he was a phony, why hadn't he said so? It was ridiculous to assume that Howard had been afraid. Fear was not one of Tip Howard's vices. Then why? About 5 o'clock the phone rang. He scooped it off the hook, his hand shaken. It was Patty. You had any news, Gumbo? She asked. No, and you? East's been all over town, but I keep missing him by minutes. Has Dunbar phoned? Not yet. There was a pause. Gumbo, I'm sorry about what I said. I was upset. Forget it, and find East, or we'll all be upset. Why don't you lamb, honey? And leave East sawed out on a limb? He'll come out of it okay, Gumbo. I'm scared. Look, I've got some dough. I'll go away with you. You're crazy in the head, Gumbo told her and hung up. Dunbar called in at 7. No luck. But he'd heard that Jake Schultz was making threats against East over the heist. Jake smelled a rat. He couldn't know, of course, but to a guy of Jake's mentality, it wasn't necessary to know. He was like a rattlesnake. Step on him, and he struck back blindly, viciously. He was literally hovering over the phone when it rang again. He grabbed it so fast, sure that it was either Patty or Dunbar, that he almost trapped himself before he recognized Captain Howard's voice. East? Oh, it's you, Tip. I was expecting... "You must have been," grunted the police captain. "You sound jumpy." Gumbo hesitated. Was this another trick? Was Howard actually with East at the moment? Cold sweat stood out on Gumbo's face. "What's on your mind?" he asked. "Plenty. I've been trying to reach you all day. Did you get my message?" "What message?" "Hell, I left word at your club for you to meet me out at the Bay Shore tonight at 10. Sober up and get the hell out there on time." "Just where?" "Usual place. At 10. Gumbo said, "I'll be there." Not to make too big of a liar out of himself, Gumbo took a drink. Then he took another. He poured the rest of the bottle down the sink to keep from getting tight. The 2 drinks merely sobered him. When finally Patty phoned in, he could have kissed her. He stopped her nervous babbling at once. "Look, babe, where does East meet Howard on the Bay Shore?" he demanded. Why, he's met him several times at the point beyond Stanley's boathouse," she stammered. "That's where Howard insists on being paid off. He doesn't trust the office." "How can I get out there?" "Why, Gumbo? Don't argue. Howard's been leaving word around town for East to meet him there tonight at 10. East may have got that message. If Howard gets to East before I do—" "A cab, I guess." "Okay. You got a gun in the apartment?" He heard her suck in her breath. "Uh-huh. In the 3rd drawer of my vanity, Gumbo. But God almighty, you going—" "You come back here and sit by the phone," he ordered sharply, "and keep your mouth shut." Gumbo found the gun, but when he hit the street, he had a harder time finding a cab. It was 9:35 then. The driver said it would be a 40-minute drive to the boathouse, but he changed his mind when Gumbo handed him a $20 bill. He made the run in exactly 20 minutes, and when Gumbo got out, he gave the driver another 20 to keep his memory. It was raining softly. Gumbo stood still until the cab vanished into the night. Then he turned and padded past the abandoned boathouse and headed out to the point. He saw tire tracks leading along the dirt road. Fresh tracks. He decided if Howard was already there with East, he'd force a showdown. It might as well come now as later. He checked the chamber of the little revolver and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. There was only one car, and with a sigh of relief, he saw that it was East's. He ran forward. The dash lights were on, and in the pale half-light he could make out East behind the wheel. East was alone. "Thank God," growled Gumbo, opening the off door. "I've been trying all over—" He stopped abruptly. "East!" He put out his hand and touched the other man. But East Chastain was dead. Chapter 6. Gumbo couldn't believe it. He grabbed East's shoulder again and shook him. East's head hobbled loosely and fell sideways on the seat. Gumbo stood back. He was taken completely by surprise. His only thought had been to reach East before Howard got there. Now that East was dead, he was lost. His watch told him it was 4 minutes past 10. The thought struck him that perhaps Howard was already there. Perhaps Howard had done this thing. Gumbo felt sick. He had no affection for East Chastain, yet it came to him that perhaps he was responsible. It was just possible that Howard had thought to lure not East Chastain, but Gumbo Wire out here and murder him. Gumbo explored that hypothesis. At first, it made no sense. Then a complicated picture began to form. It would be typical of a crooked mind like Tip Howard's to figure out a deal like that. If Gumbo's body were found in Chastain's car, in Chastain's clothes, masquerading as East himself, East would be over the proverbial barrel. Howard could lead him by a ring in his nose the rest of his career. As in a dream, Gumbo heard a car drone along the Bay Shore road. It jerked him out of his trance. He opened the turtle back of the coupe, then went back to the seat and hauled East's body out, getting his shoulder under East's middle. A long envelope fell to the ground. Gumbo dumped the corpse in the turtle back, and, as he stooped to retrieve the envelope, a car turned on the highway into the dirt road. Gumbo slammed down the back and ducked into the seat as the headlights washed across the coupe. There was blood on Gumbo's hand. He wiped it off and glanced in the envelope. It was full of bills. He held them close to the dash light and rifled them. At a quick guess, he'd say there was between 6,000 and 8,000 in the pack. He shoved them into his pocket and put his hand on his gun as the car drove up alongside the coupe. Gumbo waited, and a moment later, Howard came up to the offside. Gumbo didn't move a muscle. Howard stared at him a moment. "What's wrong with you, East?" Gumbo relaxed a little and took his hand off his gun. "I guess I fell asleep," he mumbled thickly. "What time is it?" Howard chuckled and climbed in beside him. "I'm a little late," he admitted. "Jake came storming in just as I was leaving. He's burned about that heist. Figures you had something to do with that, East." Gumbo said, "Tip, we're going to have trouble with Jake." "We?" "That's right, we. You let him chisel into San Carlos. You can't expect him to take orders. Not his kind." "Well, I'll be humbly damned," the old cop growled thoughtfully. He was silent a long time, and Gumbo sensed that he had overplayed his hand. He began to wonder if Tip Howard had killed East. At first he had been sure of it, but now? "Perhaps I was wrong," Howard brooded. "That's what I wanted to see you about, East. I got a tip that Jake's going gunning for you." Gumbo started to say, "Let the punk come gunning." Then he remembered that East wasn't that kind. East would be scared as hell if somebody was out to iron him. "By God, Tip," Gumbo said, making his voice sound anxious. "What are you going to do about it?" "I won't have a killing," Howard said. Gumbo thought he sounded relieved. "We've had things our way in San Carlos a long time. This new grand jury will die of stagnation if we stick together, but a killing of a guy of your position, East, will blow the lid off. You remember that, Tip." "I intend to. The same goes for Jake's position, so don't get any ideas of your own." "I don't get that." "I think you do," Howard said significantly. "That heist now, you think I had anything to do with that?" Howard laughed. "East, we've known each other a long time. You're full of tricks if you have the nerve to pull them. I've noticed a change in you of late." He paused to lend weight to his words. "I'd hate like hell to start having trouble with you, chum." "Well, you won't," Gumbo said, "unless—" "Yeah, unless you marry Jake Schultz." "You bring anything for me?" Gumbo suddenly remembered the envelope full of dough. He took it out and handed it to Howard. The cop looked inside, hefted the sheaf of bills, and shoved them into his pocket without counting. "Well, what about Jake?" Gumbo demanded. Howard had the car door open. He paused. "Leave him to me, East. If he bulls you or makes trouble, call me. Don't try importing any outside talent. Get that?" "I won't," Gumbo promised. "Either you handle it, or I will." Howard chuckled. "You?" and got out laughing to himself. When Gumbo reached the apartment, it was Patty who opened the door. She looked terrified out of all reason, and though he couldn't understand just why she should, it registered. Dunbar was seated on the couch, punching one big fist into the other palm. He looked up at Gumbo. Gumbo said, "East is dead." He hadn't meant to break it like that. He hadn't been sure even that he would tell them at all. He had no plan. Patty started to scream. Before Dunbar could get out of his seat, Gumbo tried to comfort her, but she fell sobbing into a chair. Dunbar ambled over to her and stood staring down. Gumbo waited. Dunbar turned finally and dropped into a chair. "Where is East?" he asked. Gumbo told them what had happened, concluding, "He's in the turtle back of the coupe down the alley. We got to get rid of him." Patty got up and started for the bedroom. Gumbo didn't like the look on her face. He caught her arm. "Leave me alone," she flared. "I'm getting out of here." He guided her back onto the couch. "The hell you say? You're part of the props in the masquerade. You're staying right here." She stared at him in amazement. "Good God! You're not going on with this crazy act?" "Well, that's the general idea. Yes." I won't. Dunbar started to heave himself erect, and she moved closer to Gumbo, blubbering hysterically. He pushed her away and went out into the kitchen. He brought back a bottle and 3 glasses. The drinks, and they were stiff ones, steadied them all. Patty most of the 3. "Let's be sensible about this," Gumbo said. "We're caught in a squirrel cage. We don't know whether we're ahead or behind. Maybe Jake Schultz killed East. Maybe it was Howard, and he thought it was me. Or perhaps he killed East knowing what he was doing. We can't know. Yet." "We can get the hell out of here," Patty cried. Gumbo said quietly. "We can't. With the government regulations, ration books, registration cards, and all that, we'd be hunted down in a few weeks. Then we'd be holding the bag. The only chance we got is to bluff it through." "Maybe," the girl said moodily. Gumbo appraised her thoughtfully. He knew he couldn't trust her, but if she pulled out now, he'd be alone. It was a lead-pipe cinch that Dunbar would tag after her. "Listen," he argued. "I'll make you a proposition. There's dough in this racket. Plenty of it. You know that. String along with me in this masquerade, and I'll split the take 3 ways. She licked her lips and Gumbo went on. "We can do it," he urged, "if we stick together. I've more nerve than East Chastain ever had. We'll clean up. If you get caught, though," Patty asked, "where'll I be?" Gumbo noticed she didn't say "we" to include her husband. He wondered if Dunbar noticed it. "Better off by a wad of dough than you are now," he answered her question. "What about East's wife?" demanded Patty. "You can't fool her." Gumbo had forgotten Rachel Chastain for the moment, and the question caught him flat-footed. "Well," he began, but Dunbar interrupted him. "I'll fix it with Mrs. Chastain," the big fellow offered. "She's a very nice lady." "You fix it?" screamed Patty contemptuously. "You?" She ran into the bedroom and slammed the door. The two men heard her flop down on the bed, and then her hysterical laughter filled the apartment. Dunbar stared at the closed door with that brooding sadness on his battered face. Gumbo managed to laugh. "Forget it, chum," he urged. "She's just scared." Dunbar wagged his head. "She's no good," he mumbled, as if to himself. "She's no good. No good." "We got East's body to worry about now," Gumbo said. Dunbar came out of his trance. He got up. "I'll do it," he offered. "I'll go along," Gumbo said, but the ex-wrestler shook his head. "You better get ready to go to the club. It'll look funny if you ain't there." Gumbo looked down at his sodden clothes. Dunbar caught the look. "I'll stop at Mrs. Chastain's and pick up some clothes for you. I often did that for East. She won't think nothing." "Maybe not tonight she won't," Gumbo mused, "but after a few days—" "Well, maybe by then it won't matter," growled the other man, and walked out of the apartment. Gumbo found some clean underclothing in the spare bedroom, so he laid them out and went into the shower. He lazed through it, trying to let the water purify his spirit as well as his body. He had always thought of San Jacinto Prison as the acme of sordidness, but there was something dank and unhealthy about this present mess that sickened him. It wasn't the graft and corruption and murder. It was something deeper than that. Something Gumbo couldn't frame into words, but it was real and tangible. The shower helped. He shaved, then he went into the bedroom and dressed. When he came out of the room, he heard Patty leave the apartment, and shortly afterwards Dunbar came in and sat down. Dunbar said, "Where was she going, Gumbo?" "How do I know? She's your wife, mister." Dunbar heaved himself erect. "Yeah, she's my wife." "Well, we better get down to the club." Those 2 hours at the Sphinx Club were the toughest Gumbo Wire had ever experienced. Meeting a half-hundred strangers whom he was supposed to know with varying shades of intimacy was bad enough, but not knowing what was on Dunbar's twisted mind was worse. Yet without the slug-nutty bodyguard, he would have been lost. They didn't talk on the way down. Dunbar drove in moody silence. When he parked the car, he said only, "I'll speak to anybody you ought to know." It went like that. The pug ugly inside the door said, "Evening, Mr. Chastain." Dunbar said, "Hi, Tim." Gumbo asked, "How's the crowd, Tim?" They wandered among the games, Gumbo taking his cues from Dunbar. Once a croupier frowned, a little puzzled, so Gumbo said, "Got a hell of a toothache," and the man nodded sympathetically. As they started up the stairs to where a serious poker game was operating in the room above, Gumbo whispered, "How'm I doing, Dunbar?" The big fellow shrugged. "Don't talk too much." The dealer got up to make room for Gumbo, but Gumbo shook his head and tapped his cheek. Dunbar said, "Chief's got one hell of a toothache, Frank. He don't want to sit in." A fat man with a bald place laughed. "I came back to retrieve that 1,500 you lifted the other night, East." "Take it away, Frank," Gumbo said, holding his mouth stiff, and everybody laughed. "Well, we made it," Dunbar commented, driving back to the apartment. "I guess the first time's the worst. I wonder." He also wondered about a lot of other things, about Patty and Howard and Jake and Rachel. She'd have to be handled sooner or later. Gumbo suffered a sinking sensation. They visited the Sphinx the following night. It went off easier. Gumbo had a good memory, and he spoke now without prompting to the men he'd met the night before. Perhaps he could get away with it. He began to feel better. Then, on the 4th day, he got the call from Howard. Chapter 7. Gumbo was alone in the apartment when Howard telephoned. Patty had been going out a lot the last few days, and Dunbar had been equally mysterious. Gumbo was jumpy every time the phone rang, dreading it might be Rachel. She had called once, but Dunbar had taken the line and assured her that East was somewhere around town. He was, but only Dunbar knew where the body lay. So Gumbo got the call, and the moment Howard started to talk, Gumbo knew this was it. Not from anything Howard said, not even from the way he said it. There's a sort of faint overtone to death. Men who have lived close to it recognize the thing. Maybe it's intuition, premonition, hunch, call it what you will. Gumbo knew it. East, there's been talk. I want you to meet me tonight. Where, Tip? I don't want to get far from the station house, but you can't come here. Make it Conover's back room. Have your gorilla drop you over and drop you off. Don't tell him you're meeting me. I'll explain why when I see you. Come in by the alley. I'll be there by 11. Trouble? Plenty. A pause. But nothing we can't settle. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Gumbo said. At 11 then. Gumbo chain-smoked a pack of cigarettes before Dunbar came in. He explored the angles. Suppose Howard knew. He might be trying to smoke Gumbo into lambing and get him on the run. More likely he was walking him into a frame. If Howard didn't know, Gumbo shook his head, another heart-to-heart talk with the old cop would uncover him. This was it. And yet he wasn't ready to quit. He'd risked his life to come back here to San Carlos to square a grudge. He wanted to send a lot of grafting, framing, political corruption to the place where they had sent him, San Jacinto Penitentiary. No, there was only one thing to do. Kill Howard himself. Gumbo had no compunctions about shooting Howard. He was a rat and a killer, but he had hoped for more time. There was no more time. When Dunbar came in, Gumbo asked him about Conover's. Dunbar told him it was a pawnbroker's shop where the crooked cops disposed of stolen property. If a citizen discovered his stuff in Conover's, he had to buy it back anyhow. It was a good graft, small, but enough to keep cops like Howard in good scotch. Gumbo told Dunbar Hammerstein about Howard's call. Dunbar was only half listening, and Gumbo suspected he was thinking about his wife. When he concluded his story, Dunbar glanced up. You going, Gumbo? I've got to. You're going to kill Howard, ain't you? Gumbo shrugged. I don't know. Some people deserve killing, reflected Dunbar. They're no good. He got up and went into the bedroom. At 7, Patty had not come home. Gumbo and Dunbar made a meal of eggs and scotch. Gumbo ate the eggs. Dunbar drank the scotch. It had no more effect on him than the eggs had on Gumbo. If you kill him, Dunbar ruminated, we'll have to lamb. You always got to lamb when you kill somebody. I wondered about that, Gumbo admitted. Could you scare up a little of East dough? Dunbar shook his head. Not without a note from East. I used to go pick up dough, but I had to have a note. East didn't trust nobody. You got any samples of East handwriting? Dunbar got up without speaking and returned with a couple of letters. They were written to Patty, nothing so personal anyone could take exception to them, but there was an undercurrent. Gumbo studied them a moment, then went over to the table. He mentally blessed old Bo Jenkins, the forager who had given him lessons. Tell me what East used to say, Dunbar. He wrote what the big fellow dictated. On the third attempt, he was satisfied. He gave the note to Dunbar. How's the gas situation? East had plenty of coupons. Get the coupe tanked to the gills, Gumbo suggested, and be back here by 10:30 sharp. Dunbar had barely got out of the building when Rachel called. Gumbo tried to stall her, without much luck. I don't know who you are, Rachel Chastain said crisply, but this is the third time I've called for my husband. If I do not hear from him by morning, I shall call the police. And she hung up. Gumbo slowly pronged the receiver. Nice going, chump, he told himself. Your card house is toppling around your ears, and you haven't enough sense to scramble from under. He reheated the coffee and sat planning to kill a man. It wasn't easy. Gumbo had gotten his schooling in the toughest college in the world, and yet, somehow, the old Gumbo, the boy who once had ideals, kept cropping up. Howard was no good. There was no argument about that. The lives he had broken on the rack of his graft were legion. And yet, when Gumbo thought of blasting the life out of him, he cringed. Patty Hammerstein sauntered into the apartment about 8:15. Gumbo studied her. Her eyes had a tired but more contented look. Gumbo grinned. Want to go stepping tonight? She heaved a long sigh. Be a love and get me a nice stiff drink. He did that. Watching her gulp the stuff, he saw with suddenly sharpened perception. The whole picture jumped complete into his consciousness. His heart started to pound. Was there time? He said, "Well, baby, we're set." She peered over the rim of her glass. "Set?" "Yeah, I'm taking your advice. About Jake Schultz." "Oh, Gumbo, then you're going to run?" You're not very subtle, he thought. Aloud, he said, I'm going to rub Jake out before he gets me." Her hand started to shake. "Tell me," she whispered. "Sure, and why not? We're in this together. You warned me he was tough. Well, so am I. I figured to beat him to it. I've got a sweet setup to trap him tonight." She put the glass down slowly. The weighted bottom beat a nervous tattoo on the tabletop. "Go on." "Howard and I are going to get Jake into the back room of Conover's pawn shop. That'll take care of Jake." "Tonight?" "Yeah, about 11. You stick here so I'll have an alibi." She said, "Sure, Gumbo." But her face was pale beneath the paint. He got up to make it easy for her to make a move. She sat staring into her empty glass a while, then slowly pulled to her feet. "Where's Dunbar?" "He's out on a job for me," Gumbo told her. "He won't be back for a while." She strolled into the living room. "Well, I'll go down to the lobby and pick up the mail," she said casually. "Then I'll go to bed." He said okay and went into his room. When he heard the hall door close, he came back out and listened for the elevator. The instant it started down again, he padded into the corridor and ran for the stairs. By the time he reached the lobby below, Patty was already in the phone booth. He stood in the curve of the stairs and watched her. He saw her fumble, trying to put a coin in the slot. She laid her lips close to the mouthpiece and spoke rapidly. He took the 5 flights 2 steps at a time. From East's address book, he got Jake's number and called from the phone in the kitchen. The line was busy. Not a bad guess, chump, he told himself. He lighted a cigarette and waited. He heard Patty come in, but she avoided him and went directly into her bedroom, closing the door. He called Jake's number again, knowing only too damn well she was listening. Jake himself answered the phone. "This is East," Gumbo said. Jake's voice was unnaturally suave. "Yeah? What's on your mind, chum? How do you like to sell out to me, Jake? You nuts?" Gumbo hesitated. "Look, how about meeting me tonight at 11? "Why?" "Self-protection. It's about Howard. Important." "Where?" "Conover's back room. There won't be anybody around. I fixed that." There was a long, thoughtful pause. Jake's voice was harsh when he said, "I'll see you at 11. If you're serious, bring some sugar." He hung up. Dunbar drove with that peculiar, preoccupied air of a man with too many drinks under his belt. Gumbo noticed the clock on the courthouse. It was 11:15. They stalled, smoking, not speaking. Dunbar had something on his twisted mind, something he couldn't bring himself to talk about. Gumbo, on his part, tried not to think too much. He was in the position of a matador baiting 2 bulls, trying to get them to crash head-on without crippling himself. It was risky business. At 5 of 11, he had Dunbar drop him at the mouth of the alley. He glimpsed a car parked in the shadows of the street, but he deliberately kept from looking at it directly. "Want I should wait?" Dunbar asked anxiously. Gumbo shook his head. "No, you go back to the apartment and wait for me." He hesitated, then reached in and slapped the big fellow on the shoulder. "Pal, look, if I don't come back or telephone within half an hour, take this and scram out of town. And don't tell your wife." This was a roll of bills, which Gumbo shoved into the man's hand. Gumbo entered the dark canyon of the alley, his gun in his hand. He moved swiftly, lightly, keeping close against the building on his left. From the careful description Dunbar had given him, he had the pawn shop's position clearly etched in his mind. He saw it. A dirty yellow globe burned palely over the door. Instead of going directly to it, he crossed the alley to the airway of a restaurant on the opposite side. He fitted himself into the dirty slot between 2 dark buildings and waited. Howard came heavily, steadily, sure and flat on his feet. Gumbo flattened into his niche, peering into the darkness. As he expected, he saw the vague shadow of another cop hovering near the mouth of the alley. Gumbo's heart began to pound. It happened almost all too fast to follow. Howard reaching the pawn shop, opening it with one hand and drawing his gun with the other. There was a pair of orange flashes from the interior, the double bark of a gun. As Howard sagged on his side, the bulky figure of Jake Schultz ran past him. Before Jake had gone a dozen paces, the cop at the alley's mouth cut him down. Then people began flooding the alley from both ends, and Gumbo merged with the first wave. He heard the cop explaining loudly, "Me and Captain was cruising. We saw this guy sneak in here like a burglar. Then Cap followed, and..." Gumbo knew the story better than the cop did. He circled the ever-growing mob and caught a cab. He dropped the cab about 4 blocks from the apartment house and walked the rest of the way. He took out the gun, wiped it carefully, and dropped it down the first sewer opening. From now on, there would be no need for guns. The elation he had expected to feel was strangely missing. He had no sympathy for the 2 murdering scoundrels who had been killed, yet there was an ache in his middle that plagued him. There was no completeness, no satisfaction. He opened the apartment door with the key Dunbar had given him. Patty was laying in the center of the floor. She wore a soiled kimono, and her neck was twisted grotesquely. She was dead. Dunbar Hammerstein sat on the edge of a chair, staring at her. His long arms hung limply between his legs, and his hands opened and closed convulsively. He didn't even hear Gumbo come in. Tears coursed on the lines of his broken face as he kept repeating over and over, "She was no good, no good, no good." Gumbo took the big fellow by the elbow and led him into the kitchen, where they couldn't see the dead girl. Dunbar let himself be shoved into the nook and faithfully drank the whiskey Gumbo poured for him. He came around slowly and turned his dog eyes on Gumbo. "You're all right?" he asked plaintively. "Sure, fella, I'm all right," Gumbo said. "Why?" Dunbar still acted like he didn't believe Gumbo was alive. "But she double-crossed us," he persisted. "She's been playing with Jake Schultz. She tipped him off where you was going. She bragged you was going to be killed." Gumbo nodded. "I knew that. Jake killed Tip Howard, and Howard's partner killed Jake." "She was no good," Dunbar sobbed. She was just no good." He made a cradle of his arms for her head. "Oh, my God, I loved her, but she was no good." Watching the big man, Gumbo knew he was through. He was filled with an overpowering compassion for the poor devil. It must be hell to love a woman that much, any woman, but to worship someone like Patty? "Dunbar," he said crisply, "you better blow. The cops will be wanting to talk with me, and you're in no condition to meet 'em. You take the coupe and scram. I'll get rid of Patty." "Oh, no," gasped Dunbar, lurching to his feet. No. She'll go with me." Gumbo winced. "But she's..." He stopped short at the look on the man's face. "Okay," he said. They went into the living room. "She'll need her fur coat," Dunbar muttered. "It's cold out this time of night." He went into the bedroom and brought out a mink coat. Gumbo shuddered as he watched Hammerstein jockey the dead girl into the coat. He did it with incredible tenderness. When he finally lifted her into his arms, she might have just been sleeping. Gumbo walked with Dunbar to the door. "Look, fella, are you sure?" Gumbo began. "Yeah, I'm sure," Hammerstein said. "We'll go wait together. There won't be no other guys bothering us. I always wanted it like that, Gumbo." Gumbo shoved the rest of the roll into Dumbo's pocket. "Good luck," he said, and quickly closed the door. He knew he'd never see the Hammersteins again. The strain was beginning to tell on him. He glanced in the mirror and saw a face that startled him. It was not the face of Danny Gumbo. It was the bitter, worn, and delusioned face of East Chastain. "My God," Gumbo said aloud, "I am East now." Was he going crazy like Dunbar? Or was Dunbar sane and life just a crazy masquerade? He'd have to stick around and find that out. The morning papers were full of it. They ran 2 column cuts of both Jake Schultz and Captain Howard. Howard was a hero, they said, a martyr. But the lid was off, and the grand jury wanted to question East Chastain. The reporters, the paper said, hadn't been able to locate East. His wife, when questioned, reported she had not seen him for several days. East's attorney, Jerry Vestal, announced that he would produce East when required. Gumbo read that over twice. Then he looked up Vestal in the phone book and made a note of the number. He lighted a cigarette and began to pace the living room. He walked to the window and stood staring out into the morning fog. The white mists acted as a screen for the pictures that moved before his eyes. East, Patty, Dunbar, Howard, all the characters in this sword drama. Then he thought of old Bo Jenkins in San Jacinto. They had put Bo in solitary now, making him pay for Gumbo's escape. They believed Gumbo was dead. Gumbo is dead, Gumbo assured himself. He stood out the cigarette, forcing himself to reach a decision. Sooner or later the cops would come. If they fingerprinted him, he was through. With Dunbar gone, he couldn't carry on the masquerade. He tried to remember why he had returned to San Carlos in the first place. You wanted to pay off a debt, he reminded himself. You had big dreams of breaking up the rotten machine. Sap, sucker, dreamer. He could run even now. But for what? To be a fugitive the rest of his days? The thought made him sick with despair. He shook his head. He'd gamble on one more toss. One chance in a million. He scooped up the phone and called Vestal's number. He got the lawyer on the wire. "This is East," he said crisply. "Meet me at the grand jury in half an hour." Wait a minute, East," pleaded the lawyer. "You can't do that." "Well, why in hell can't I?" There was a pause. "East, are you all right?" "Certainly." "You don't sound all right." "Where are you?" "I'll come over." "I'll see you at the grand jury rooms," Gumbo insisted. In half an hour. Vestal was still arguing when Gumbo hung up. He walked down a corridor of flashing photograph bulbs. There was a tall, worried-looking man waiting for him at the door marked Grand Jury. The man reminded Gumbo of those gray thatched figures in an Esquire clothing advertisement. A photographer shouted, "Hold it, East! I want to get one with you and Jerry." Vestal said, "Make it snappy, boys. I want a word with East." They posed briefly, and Vestal led him into a small anteroom. "What in hell has happened to you?" the lawyer said. Gumbo shrugged. "I've had a bellyful, Jerry. I'm through." The lawyer was looking at him closely, a puzzled expression on his face. "He's suspicious," Gumbo admitted. "I'm going to flop before I get my say." "You're either sick or crazy," Vestal said slowly. "Don't talk. No one has a thing on you. But if you talk, you'll upset the apple cart." "I'm not going to argue with you," Gumbo said bluntly. "I've had enough. I'm going to talk." Vestal wiped his face with a handkerchief. "Very well. You got enough to live on the rest of your life, I know. But you'll be through in San Carlos if you do. I'm already through. Wait here. I'll get you a guarantee of immunity." He hesitated. "You'll have to get another attorney after that, East, if you need one." Gumbo nodded and sat down. Vestal was gone about 20 minutes. His face was pale when he returned. "You can go in now, East," he said bitterly. "And goodbye." Gumbo walked into the grand jury room and took his seat. He stared down into the score of grim faces. These men despised him. They wanted to clean up San Carlos. They couldn't know that Gumbo wanted it as much as they did. He talked for 2 hours. He told them things about San Carlos that even East Chastain never knew. He told them about Tip Howard and his graft, where they could check on his holdings. He told them about Jake Schultz, about Judge Taylor, and Cantrell the mayor. He talked quickly, expecting at any moment to have the door open and be denounced as an imposter. He gave them all the data he had garnered from 100 sources in San Jacinto, and he knew they would act. These were solid citizens. These men wanted a decent town. They were silent, shocked when he concluded. The foreman said, "That will be all, Mr. Chastain. You have done a public service." Gumbo smiled. He had accomplished his purpose, and now he'd take his medicine. He walked out of the grand jury room to a battery of cameras. Vestal was still there, grim and thoughtful. He knows, Gumbo thought. This is it. He walked towards the lawyer, and then he saw Rachel standing beside him. The reporters crowded around. Gumbo walked straight towards her. Vestal glanced down at her. "Well?" he prompted. Her small, oval face was very pale, and her sensitive nostrils quivered. Gumbo felt a little giddy. "I'm terribly sorry," he began, but she moved swiftly forward and kissed him. "East," she said huskily, "I'm so glad for what you've done." Gumbo couldn't speak. He heard the reporters jabbering, the flashbulbs popping, saw the look on Vestal's face. He felt Rachel take his arm and lead him away. They walked out to the street to a sedan parked at the curb. "You drive, please," she said, and climbed into the front seat. The warm sunshine had melted the fog. It was a good world. There were children on the streets and laughter in the air. They stopped for a red light. When it turned green, Rachel said, "Dunbar told me. He came over in the middle of the night and explained everything. It was a shock, I must admit, but—" Her voice trailed away. He drove in silence until he reached the house. He wheeled the sedan into the driveway, and she started to get out. "I can only say thanks, Mrs. Chastain," he managed. "There's just one thing I'd like you to believe. I didn't hurt East." "I know that. Dunbar shot him. Perhaps it was just as well. Somebody else would have. I wanted to leave East, but he threatened to kill me." She met Gumbo's eyes. "Where are you going?" "I don't know." She studied her hands a long time. "You'll be needed at the trials coming up. Jerry Vestal said so. I don't know anything about East's affairs. Perhaps you could help. The future is so uncertain." Gumbo stared at her. Maybe the future will take care of itself. The end. This has been Ribald, a cozy mystery adventure. The Gumbo Files. Written by Curtis Long. Narrated by Scott Kerr. Production copyright by Grand Ozarks Media.